He is so happy. Yes, he is my best friend. Be sure to subscribe to my channel. I've never subscribed to the idea of the paranormal or any folklore stories of the supposed mysterious creatures that lurk about in the night. I honestly still don't know whether I do or don't believe, but I certainly don't have an explanation for what I saw on the night of August 19, 2007. I have never encountered anything like this before or since that night, and I've only ever told this story to my wife, who I didn't know yet at the time. I'm sharing this story in the dedication of the man who saved my life that night. I had just turned 20 years old 2 months prior and had planned my first real vacation for myself as an adult. My best friend Harry and I had our sights set on the Smoky Mountains, which, for those who don't know, is a mountain range inside the Appalachian Mountains on the eastern side of the United States. It's home to a wide range of popular destinations and an outdoor lover's dream with varying activities to enjoy, such as trails, whitewater rafting, fishing, and mountain climbing. All of which we had planned on doing. Harry and I had come to be somewhat the outdoorsmen over the past year, tackling some of our local trails and hiking destinations, and we were looking to challenge ourselves with something new and a bit more involved. We had been planning this trip since November of the previous year and had even gone as far as to purchase our plane tickets, hotel reservations and car rental months in advance. We already own most of the gear that was needed, so there would be little additional costs other than food, water, and a few other items once we were there. Well, about a week before we were slated to leave, Harry called me and told me he wasn't going to be able to go. His girlfriend, who would later become his wife, was 7 months pregnant at the time and having a lot of medical issues that required constant doctor's visits. Naturally, he was worried about her and didn't want to leave in the fears that more complications might arise while he was gone. The trip was going to be 5 days long and I agreed that she shouldn't be left alone in her condition. I was disappointed but also understood that the family had to come first. The thing is, I was stuck at this point. I definitely didn't want to go alone, since the whole trip was planned around Harry and I spending some time together, but we had already purchased tickets and put down deposits, most of which was non-refundable. Call me a cheapskate, but the thought of all that hard-earned money we had put into this going down the drain made my stomach turn. To my surprise, Harry urged me to go by myself, at one point even saying, "Half of that money was mine. I don't want it to go to waste. Consider it a very expensive late birthday present from me and you can just owe me a big one." He laughed. I thought it over for the next couple of days, and the more I thought about it, the more I liked the idea of going by myself. I've always been a loner at heart, so the idea of me being on my own among that beautiful landscape was very appealing. Plus, the starter trails we had picked out weren't dangerous and were actually some of the more popular trails that were available, so it's not like I would be totally alone. With that in mind, I made my decision to go. A few days later I was disembarking my plane. I hastily grabbed my baggage, picked up my rental car and headed to check into my hotel, which was about 45 minutes away. On the way there I was taking in the scenery. It was certainly incredible. Where I'm from we have mountains too, but they aren't as lush and inviting as these were. I arrived at my hotel at sunset and promptly checked in. I asked the guy behind the counter where I could get some supplies and he told me about a general store a couple of minutes down the road that would have anything I needed. I thanked him and headed that way. I didn't buy much in preparation for my first day, just some granola bars, sandwich items, a few bottles of water and a canister of bear mace. The mountains are native to black bears, among other predators, and I wanted to be as prepared as I could. I also had a 6-inch knife that I brought in my check bag, along with a pocket knife, just in case. I headed back to my hotel and turned in early for the night. I woke up right after sunrise feeling excited and ready to hit the trail. I drove about 15 minutes to where my first trial began and only brought the map I had printed off from my home computer, my phone, and my pack. It was about a 5-mile round trip and took me around an hour and a half to complete. I was in awe of the scenery, constantly stopping to take in the sights, especially when the trees would break and reveal miles of green mountains. I wish I was a better writer so I could describe how it looked. All I had to go on previously were the Google images I had surveyed numerous times. Even those couldn't convey just how breathtaking it was. And I know it's cliché to say that, but there was just something about it that moved me. Interestingly, I didn't come across any other hikers, which I thought was a bit odd. I mean, I didn't think I was going to see a lot of people, but I suppose I expected to see one or two. Not that I'm complaining, as I said, I'm a loner at heart. Once I made it back to the car, I headed for the next trail. This one was going to take me the rest of the day to complete, and I was eager to see what it had to offer. I arrived just as a fellow hiker was coming off the trail and heading towards their car. It was the only other car there, so I figured I'd be alone on this trail as well. I've never been the type of person to initiate a conversation with a stranger without a reason, but I guess my good mood got the better of me. I waved and he returned the wave with a smile. "How is it up there?" I asked, pointing toward the trailhead. He took a sip of water and shook his head with a grin. "It's unreal. The weather couldn't be any better either," he replied. I situated my pack on my back and asked if this was his first time taking this trail. He said it wasn't. He had frequented this trail over the past decade or so. "Just make sure you stay on the main trail," he warned. "There are some offshoots that will take you to some pretty remarkable areas, but I would advise staying on the main path since it's your first time. Those smaller trails can get you lost if you don't know what you're doing." I held up my map and jokingly said, "Hopefully she'll take care of me." He grinned. "Yeah, well, most of those smaller trails aren't marked on any map. Just be careful." I said I would, thanked him. We waved goodbye and I set out on the trail. I stopped after a couple of hours to eat lunch at a small rest area with some tables and benches scattered around a clearing. I sat alone, eating my sandwich, zoning out as I chewed away. I had been off in my head for a few minutes when my brain told me something was off. I lifted my head from looking down at my sandwich and looked around to figure out what my brain was trying to tell me. But it wasn't something it wanted me to see, it was something it wanted me to hear, or in this case, not hear, as I couldn't hear anything at all. All day I had been hearing the sounds of the forests and wildlife, birds chirping and squirrels running about, the wind blowing the trees and leaves back and forth. But right now it was completely and utterly silent. All I could hear was the sound of me breathing. For the first time that day I was unsettled. It's like some primal part of my brain was triggering a red flag. Not telling me that I was necessarily in danger, but that something just wasn't right. I quickly finished my sandwich and set back out on the trail. The further I got from the rest area, the more things seemed to go back to normal. All the familiar forest sounds returned and I shook off the incident as me just overanalyzing and making something out of nothing. I arrived at one of the noted scenic locations on the trail. There was a river so clear you could see right to all the little stones that lay beneath. For many, This may not be a sight to behold, but where I'm from all the rivers and lakes are made up of murky, brown water which is very unappealing. This river cascaded over a cliff face, making a waterfall that landed in a small valley about 50 feet below where I was standing. This also marks the first time I had seen a waterfall in person. A real waterfall at least. Like the ones you see in movies and on cell phone and desktop wallpapers. I made a mental note to get a picture of it when I headed back to the car. For the walkout, I was keeping my phone off to conserve the battery and had intended on turning it on for my walk back to get some pictures when the sun was setting. Over the next couple of hours, I continued taking in the sights and sometimes zoning out, as I have a tendency to do. I've always had a habit of going away inside my head when I walk long distances or when doing something mundane. At one point though, I had zoned out longer than I should have, and when I snapped to, I realized I wasn't on the main trail anymore. I knew this because the main trail up to that point had been carved out of the dirt from decades of foot traffic and was generally about 6 feet wide. This trail was about double the width of one of my feet, and the surrounding trees and brush were closing in on me, making me feel somewhat claustrophobic. I sighed, knowing this was going to set me back and hoping I hadn't gone too far off track. I turned around and began walking back to the main trail. I walked for about 30 minutes, and when I hadn't reached the main trail yet, I stopped and pulled out my map. I knew which landmark I last passed and which one I hadn't reached yet, and figured I had to have gotten separated from the trail somewhere between those 2 points. The problem was there were no landmarks that I could make out around me that I could see on the map. I continued walking for another 10 to 15 minutes and I still couldn't make anything out. I was getting a little worried at this point, but I knew I had been on this trail the whole time, so logically, if I kept following this it would have to lead me back to where I got separated. Right? I felt like I was going in circles as the scenery around me wasn't changing at all. It seemed like I was passing the same trees and rocks over and over again. I pulled out my phone, but of course, I had no service. Then it happened again. Almost like a switch was flipped and all the sounds just ceased to exist. Complete silence. I stopped and tuned my ears in, listening for even the slightest sound. But I heard nothing. Just my breathing again, which was getting heavier as I became more frightened. I began moving and quickened my step, just wanting to get away from the silence as I had before. But this time it followed me, like a haunting spirit. I swear I walked for what seemed like an hour, and by that time I was almost running. Suddenly I heard a loud snap, like a thick branch being broken over someone's knee. Having heard nothing but total silence for the past I don't even know how long, this scared the hell out of me and I froze in place like a deer. I diligently scanned the area. The trees and brush were so thick I could only see maybe 20 feet around me in any direction. As the reality of the situation set in, my heart began pounding and that uneasy feeling fell back over me. My brain was sending me signals again. This time, it was telling me I was in danger. The silence was broken again by another loud snap. Now, mind you, this was not the sound a small branch makes when someone steps on it and it breaks. This was different. It sounded like something being broken purposely, with intent. I bolted, keeping on the trail and not looking behind me. I've never run faster. I felt like I was running for my life, even though I didn't even know if anything was in pursuit. I couldn't tell you how long I ran. What I can tell you is that I was still on the same small trail. I never even passed any other trails. It felt like it was never ending. Like a dream where you're running down a hallway that never ends. I finally came upon a bend that I hadn't seen before, and I felt slight relief in just seeing something different, giving me hope that I was at least not going in circles. Just as I rounded the turn, the silence ended and all the sound returned at once. I stopped to finally catch my breath. I was panting heavily, bent over with my hands on my knees. "Hey, are you okay?" I heard a deep voice calling out to me. I jerked my head up, and my face must have told him I was in distress as he put his hands up as if to signify he wasn't going to hurt me. He was a large man, over 6 feet tall, the mid to late 40s, trimmed beard, short hair and very muscular. He had a large, military-style pack on his back. He ran over to me. "Do you need help? Are you hurt?" he asked, looking me over for injuries. I was so out of breath I could barely speak between exhales. I pointed behind me and could manage to get out something and chasing me. He darted behind me and made the bend before coming back a few moments later. "There's nothing back there." "Was it a bear? Did you see it?" I shook my head, took a seat on the ground and retrieved the last water out of my pack. I drank the entire bottle in 3 or 4 swallows. The man walked closer to me and asked again if I was okay. I nodded, finally catching my breath. "Yeah. I somehow got off the main trail and got myself lost. Then I panicked a bit." He put his hands on his hips and looked out into the forest. "It's easy to get lost out here. What trail were you on?" I got up, handed him my map from my pack and pointed out where I originally was. He scratched at his beard. "I don't know how the hell you got all the way over here. You're over 7 miles off course." I shook my head in disbelief. "How could that be possible? Are you sure?" He handed me my map back. "Yeah. I know exactly where we are. I can take you back that way." I looked at him and stuttered, slightly embarrassed at the thought of me seems like a lost child that needs help. "Oh, I couldn't put you out like that. That would put you off course by 14 miles, wouldn't it?" He patted his pack and grinned. "That's what this baby is for." He paused for a moment and studied my face as I considered his proposal. He proceeded, "Look, I'd rather know you got back safe than to send you back out on these unmarked trails. It's not safe out here for someone who doesn't know the area, and it will get dark pretty soon." I knew he was right. I didn't want to let my pride get me lost again, and possibly for good. "Thank you. Honestly, I don't know that I could get back on my own," I said, relieved. He introduced himself as Tom. I introduced myself and we shook hands. He had a firm handshake and I noticed a tattoo on his forearm. It was an insignia I immediately recognized. "Are you a Navy SEAL?" I asked. "I am. Did 22 years. Retired 3 years back," he said proudly. I have to admit, I immediately felt much safer knowing that I was in capable hands. I thanked him for his service and he smiled as he handed me a bottle of water from his pack. After I rested for a few more minutes and rehydrated, we set back out on the trail. I followed his lead as we walked. He asked me where I was from among some other small talk topics, but we mostly walked in silence. I mulled over the idea of asking him about what I had experienced. I didn't want to seem even more like a frightened child, but also figured if he frequented these parts he may have had something similar happen. "So have you ever had anything weird happen out here?" I asked hesitantly. He kept pace, not even turning his head. "Weird? How do you mean?" I paused, trying to formulate my next sentence carefully. "I don't know. Like something you can't explain." He stopped and turned towards me, studying my face again. "What exactly did you see out there?" I met his eyes with mine and said, "It wasn't something I saw. It was something I heard." One of his eyebrows arched up and he leaned in waiting for me to continue. "Okay, I know this might sound stupid, but when I was on that trail back there, it was like one moment everything was normal and the next I couldn't hear anything. It was like all the animals vanished and even the wind stopped blowing. It was completely still and totally silent. I've never experienced anything like it." His gaze left mine and his face contorted to an expression of discomfort. It was a few moments before he spoke again. "Did it happen just the once?" I shook my head. "It happened twice." I thought I could detect just the slightest twinge of fear in his eyes. Or maybe I was just projecting my own fear onto him. He quickly composed himself before saying, "We should keep moving." He immediately turned around and began walking again, noticeably faster than before. I'm not sure whether that was him validating my experience or if he was just wanting to get me back as soon as possible. I assumed the latter since he didn't say anything else. I didn't ask about it again. As the sun began to set and the sky turned from its beautiful hues of yellow and orange to a more sobering hue of dark red, Tom donned a headlamp he had retrieved from his pack so he could light the trail in front of us. He warned me to watch where I step, which I did, making sure I followed in his footsteps as closely as possible. We eventually made our way back to the main trail. As much as I didn't want to inconvenience him more than I already had, I was pleading inside my head for him to take me all the way back to my car. I didn't want to go alone. "So is this where we part ways?" I asked nervously. He didn't say anything and he motioned for me to keep following as he proceeded forward. I thought it was strange, but I wasn't in any position to argue. Nor did I want to. A few minutes went by before he turned his head slightly and quietly said, "Something has been following us for the past couple of miles. Just keep walking with me." My heart sank to my stomach. Was it a person? Or a curious animal perhaps? I moved closer to him as he continued walking. "Is it an animal?" I whispered. He turned his headlamp off without answering me and slowed his pace. I was confused and very unnerved. Then, the fear crept back over me as the forest fell silent once more. It was as if all the sounds flew away like a flock of startled birds when danger is near. As I was lost in my own thoughts, I ran into what felt like a tree trunk. It was Tom's arm. He had extended it out in front of my chest in the way a protective parent would in a car accident. I looked up at his face. I can't see very well in the dark and it was a particularly dark evening with no moon in sight, but I could make out his face, and I could see that he was looking at something with more focus than I had ever seen on a person's face. I followed his gaze in front of us, but I couldn't see anything but trees and darkness. He put his hand on my shoulder and slowly pushed me down as he got down on one knee. His eyes were still set forward, unmoving. He whispered so quietly that I almost couldn't hear him, "Don't move. Don't make a sound." My heart was pounding so hard I thought I could hear it echo through the silence. Tom slowly reached his hand back to his bag, still not averting his gaze, and came back out holding a pistol. I don't know anything about guns, so I couldn't tell you what kind it was. I just knew it was a pistol. This scared me even more. If he was this worried, what could possibly be out there? I thought about retrieving my knife, but to be honest I was so scared I'm not sure I could have moved if I had wanted to. I also figured if a Navy SEAL with a pistol couldn't handle whatever was out there, I stood no chance with a knife. Then the most terrifying thing I have ever experienced happened. The silence was broken by someone calling out, "Hello? Is anyone there? I hurt my foot and need help." My eyes darted back to Tom. He didn't move an inch. I wasn't sure what to do or what was even happening. The voice called out again for the help. It was a male voice. Probably around my age. But there was something wrong about it. He didn't sound in distress like he should have been. There was no emotion in the voice and it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. He sounded up the trailways but was also close enough that we could hear him clearly. "Shouldn't we help?" I asked in a hushed voice. Tom's eyes were still fixed up ahead. Then he said something that shook me to my core. "That's not a person." What did that even mean? How could that not be a person? My mind was racing and I was paralyzed with fear by what he could have meant. The darkness swallowed us as we stayed there silently. I felt like I was awaiting my death. It seemed like we were there for hours and I did as Tom instructed, not moving or speaking. The voice never called out a third time and eventually, Tom stood up slowly and motioned for me to stand up as well. I looked around us, seeing absolutely nothing. It was still totally silent. "We need to get out of here," Tom said firmly. He began moving forward again, still keeping his pistol in hand. We moved as quickly and as silently as we could. Eventually, the silence lifted like a heavy veil. I could tell Tom felt more comfortable, which in turn made me feel slightly better. I have practically attached to his hip the rest of the way, and when we finally made it back to the dead lot where I had left my car, I exhaled heavily as if I had been holding my breath the past few hours. Once we reached my car, I knew I couldn't let Tom leave. "You should come with me, Tom. You can't go back out there. I can drop you off tomorrow wherever you need to be," I said as I fumbled for my keys in my pack. He nodded and we offloaded our packs into the car. On the drive back to my hotel, I could tell he was a bit shaken up. It took a few minutes for me to muster up the courage to ask about what had happened, but I had to ask. I was still so confused. "Tom, what did you see back there? What the fuck happened?" I was desperate for answers as to what had taken place, and I knew that he had seen something. There was about half a minute of silence before he answered, "I don't know what that was." He turned his head away from me and stared out the window. It wasn't a person. I know what we heard, but that was not a person. It sounded as if he was trying to convince himself as much as he was trying to convince me. He paused to gather his thoughts, then continued, "I clocked something following us back when we were on that trail where I found you about 5 miles into our walk. At first, I assumed it was an animal of some kind. I never directly saw it. I was just hoping it wasn't a bear, and after about 15 minutes I knew it wasn't an animal. Animals lose interest quickly and they don't generally stalk a person like that. Especially not two people." He exhaled deeply. Then when everything went quiet, I knew something bad was about to happen. I felt that feeling many times. That's why I turned my headlamp off. I needed to let my eyes adjust to the dark. He paused again and nervously rubbed his knee. He turned his head forward, looking out the windshield, and mumbled something I couldn't make out. A few moments later he spoke up, and that's when I saw it. Probably 30 meters in front of us. It was pitch black, like a shadow, and it was just standing there, right in the middle of the path. I couldn't make out many details. It was tall, over 8 feet. It had unusually long arms that almost touched the ground. His voice was slightly shaking at this point. Once it caught me staring, it moved behind a boulder, like it was trying to hide. That's when it started calling us. To be honest, when I heard the voice, I was terrified. I had no idea what to do other than to stay quiet, stay low and not move. What I did know is if it approached us I was going to put 15 rounds into that goddamn thing. He looked down to his pistol, still in his hand. Jesus Christ, man, he said, slouching down into the seat. We pulled into the hotel parking lot and made our way up to my room. Tom brought his pack and laid out a sleeping bag on the floor near the door. I noticed he kept the pistol. I wasn't even sure I would be able to sleep, but as the adrenaline had subsided, the physical and mental exhaustion set in and I drifted off. I woke up to the sound of Tom packing up his sleeping bag. I sat up in bed and asked if he needed the ride I had promised. Yeah? I need to get my ass home, he said, half laughing. I got dressed, packed up my things and we headed down to the car. He directed me to where he had left his car the previous day, about 35 minutes from the hotel. It was a dirt lot similar to the one where I had parked my car the previous day. There were a few cars in the lot and he pointed me towards a dark grey Dodge Challenger. I parked next to it and we both exited the vehicle. He moved his things from my car to his and he cranked it to get the AC going. I walked around the car to him and after a few moments, I managed to say, "Listen, Tom. I still don't really know what happened. Honestly, I don't think I want to know. What I do know is you saved my life." He extended his hand for a handshake but I went in for a hug, and although he seemed surprised, he hugged me in return. I'll admit, I teared up and had to stop myself from crying. I knew with every fiber of my being that I wouldn't have survived if he hadn't been on that trail that day. "You did good, kid," he said as he patted my back. I never had a father figure growing up. And at that moment I felt like he was the closest thing I had ever had to one, despite him basically being a complete stranger. "Hold on 1 second," he said, climbing into his car and rummaging through his glove box. He came back out with a card in hand and held it out for me to take. It's an old business card, but the cell phone number on it is still correct. "If you ever need to talk, just give me a call." He smiled, I thanked him and we parted ways. I didn't stay for the remaining 4 days. I bought the first plane ticket home I could, left and never returned. I hate to say it but I stopped hiking after that. I'm not really outdoorsy anymore and I'm not sure I ever will be again. I stayed in contact with Tom. We usually chatted a couple of times a month just catching up on life. He actually came to my wedding and even helped me get a stable job with an old buddy of his after I graduated college. As time went on and I started a family, our conversations became less frequent, but he always made an effort to check in on me. I'm eternally grateful for what Tom did for me.